A few years into my gardening journey, I bought one of those hanging strawberry baskets from the garden centre. You know the ones, they look gorgeous on the display rack, loaded with bright red berries, and you think, well, that looks easy enough. I hung it on my porch, watered it when I remembered to, and waited for the harvest. By the end of summer, I had gotten maybe a dozen tiny, flavourless berries that were barely worth picking. The birds got most of them before I did anyway. I honestly thought strawberries just were not meant for containers, that you needed a proper garden bed to get anything worthwhile. I was completely wrong, and it took me an embarrassing amount of time to figure out why. This was early in my gardening journey, maybe 3 or 4 years in, and I nearly gave up on container berries entirely. But close to 15 years later, I can tell you that some of my best strawberry harvests have come out of pots on my patio. The problem was not the container. The problem was that I did not understand how growing in a pot changes the rules. The soil heats up differently. It dries out faster. Nutrients wash away with every watering. And if you do not account for those things, the plant just limps along, giving you next to nothing. Once I learned the science behind what strawberry roots actually need in a confined space, everything flipped. I started pulling handfuls of sweet, juicy berries out of the same size containers that had failed me before. In this video, I am going to walk you through my complete system for growing strawberries in containers, step by step, with the science behind every decision so you understand not just what to do, but why it works. And stick around for the bonus tip near the end, because I'm going to show you a simple off-season trick that gives you stronger, more productive plants every single year without spending a dime. That one changed my whole approach to container strawberries. Strawberries are one of the best fruits you can grow in containers, especially if you're working with limited space, poor garden soil, or want something accessible on a patio or deck. But containers change the rules of the game, and what works beautifully in a raised bed does not automatically translate to a pot. Understanding why makes all the difference. Let me put on my teacher hat here for a minute, because there are three things happening inside a container that are fundamentally different from growing in the ground, and every step in this video traces back to them. First, a container has limited soil volume, which means the root zone heats up faster in summer, cools down faster in winter, and has almost no thermal buffer. Second, that small volume of soil dries out dramatically faster than ground soil, sometimes in a matter of hours on a hot day. Third, every time you water, nutrients leach out through the drainage holes, so the soil depletes much quicker than a garden bed. The good news is that strawberry roots are naturally shallow. Most of the feeder roots sit in the top 6 to 8 inches of soil, which makes them genuinely well suited to containers as long as you manage temperature, moisture, and nutrition actively. The other piece you need to understand is variety type. Strawberries come in 3 categories: June bearing, ever bearing, and day neutral. For containers, day neutral varieties are far and away the best choice. They produce fruit continuously from late spring through fall, regardless of day length, which means you get a steady stream of berries instead of one big flush and then nothing. That continuous production is what makes container strawberries feel truly worthwhile. You're not waiting all season for one payoff. You're picking a handful of ripe berries every few days for months, and that rhythm is genuinely satisfying. Choosing the right container is the foundation of everything that follows. And this is where a lot of people go wrong right out of the gate. Strawberry roots spread outward more than they grow downward, so width matters much more than depth. You want a container that is at least 8 inches deep, but as wide as you can manage. My go-to choice is a fabric grow bag, either 10 or 15 gallon, because they are lightweight, drain beautifully, and the fabric naturally air prunes the roots, which actually encourages denser, healthier root growth. A 15-gallon bag comfortably holds 6 to 8 plants with room for the roots to spread. Window boxes work well too if you have railing space. Strawberry jars, those tall pots with pockets on the sides, look charming, but I will be honest with you, I have had mixed results. The top plants do great and the bottom pockets tend to dry out or stay too wet, depending on your watering habits. If you use one, just be aware that the watering is tricky to get even. Whatever container you choose, drainage holes are absolutely non-negotiable. Strawberry roots sitting in standing water will rot within days. The other detail that made a real difference for me was container color. I learned this the hard way one July when I was growing in dark black plastic pots. I stuck a soil thermometer in and it read over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the afternoon sun. The roots were literally cooking. Light-coloured containers or fabric bags reflect heat instead of absorbing it. And that can easily mean a 15 to 20 degree difference in root zone temperature on a hot day. Picking the right variety for your climate and your container setup matters more than most people realise. For day-neutral types, which are what I recommend for containers, you have some excellent options. If you're in zones 7 through 9 with warm summers, Albion, Seascape, and San Andreas are outstanding performers. Albion in particular produces large, firm berries with incredible sweetness, and it handles heat better than most. For cooler climates in zones 4 through 6, I lean toward EV2 and Mara. Des Bois. EV2 is a workhorse, very reliable, and disease resistant. And Mara de Bois has a flavour that is genuinely unlike any other strawberry I have ever grown. It tastes like a wild strawberry crossed with something from a French patisserie. That one is my personal favourite, and I grow it every year. You will sometimes see ever-bearing varieties recommended for containers, but I want to flag something. The name ever-bearing is honestly a little misleading. Most ever-bearing types produce 2 flushes, one in spring and one in fall, with a gap in the middle of summer. Day-neutral varieties truly produce continuously, which is a much better fit for the effort you are putting into container growing. June bearers I would skip entirely for containers. One harvest in early summer, and then the plant just sits there taking up space for the rest of the season. The soil mix you use in your containers is probably the single most impactful decision after variety choice. And I cannot stress this enough: do not use regular garden soil. Garden soil is too heavy for containers. It compacts over time, squeezes out the air pockets that roots need to breathe, and it drains poorly in a confined space. I use a high-quality potting mix as my base and then amend it. For every 5 gallons of potting mix, I add about a quart of perlite for extra drainage and a quart of finished compost for slow-release nutrition and moisture retention. The result is a mix that holds water long enough for the roots to drink, but drains freely so they never sit in a soggy mess. Strawberries also prefer slightly acidic soil, right in the range of 5.5 to 6.5 on the pH scale. Most potting mixes already fall in this range, but it is worth checking with an inexpensive pH probe, about $10 at any garden centre. If your mix runs a little alkaline, a small amount of sulphur or peat moss brings it down. The reason pH matters is that outside that slightly acidic window, the roots cannot absorb iron and manganese efficiently, and you will see it show up as yellowing leaves with green veins. When you plant, pay close attention to the crown, that thick nub where the stems meet the roots. It should sit right at the soil surface. Too deep, and moisture collects around the crown and invites rot. Too shallow, and the top roots dry out and die. You want to see the crown just barely peeking above the soil line. I cannot tell you how many plants I lost my first couple of seasons by burying the crown a half-inch too deep. It seems like such a tiny detail. But for strawberries, it is the difference between a thriving plant and one that rots from the centre out. Watering is where container growing demands the most attention, and it is the step where I see people struggle the most. In a garden bed, the surrounding ground acts as a moisture buffer. In a container, you do not have that buffer. On a hot summer day, a 10-gallon fabric bag can go from perfectly moist to bone dry in a matter of hours. I check my containers every single morning during the growing season, and on days above 85 degrees, I check again in the late afternoon. The test is simple. Push your finger into the soil about 1 inch deep. If it feels dry at your fingertip, water thoroughly until liquid drains out the bottom. If it still feels damp, leave it alone. Always water in the morning. This gives the foliage time to dry before evening, which matters because wet leaves overnight are an invitation for fungal diseases, especially grey mold, which will destroy ripe berries faster than almost anything else. Water at the soil line, not over the top of the plant. A small watering can with a narrow spout works perfectly, or you can run a thin drip line into each container if you want to automate it. For anyone with limited mobility or who travels frequently, self-watering containers with a built-in reservoir are an excellent option. They maintain consistent moisture in the root zone without daily attention. I set my mother up with a couple of these on her apartment balcony, and she picks berries all summer long without ever worrying about missing a watering day. If you're finding this helpful so far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I put out new videos every week breaking down the science behind growing better food at home. It is completely free, and it means you will not miss the next one. All right, let us keep going. Feeding container strawberries is one of those areas where understanding the science saves you from two very common mistakes. Because nutrients wash out every time you water, container soil becomes depleted much faster than ground soil. If you do not replenish those nutrients regularly, the plant has nothing to work with, and your berries will be small and bland. My approach is two-layered. At planting time, I mix a balanced, slow-release organic fertilizer into the soil, something with roughly equal parts nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That gives the plant a steady baseline for the first several weeks. Then, starting about 3 weeks after planting and continuing every 2 to 3 weeks through the season, I supplement with a half-strength liquid fertilizer. Once the plant starts flowering, the nutrient priority shifts, and this is the part that catches people off guard. At that point, potassium becomes more important than nitrogen. Potassium drives sugar production in the fruit, which is what gives you sweet, flavorful berries. Nitrogen drives leaf and vine growth. If you keep pushing heavy nitrogen after flowers appear, you will get a gorgeous, leafy plant that produces barely any fruit. I made this exact mistake my second year of container strawberries. Beautiful foliage, almost no berries. I switched to a tomato fertilizer, which tends to have a higher potassium ratio, and the difference the following season was remarkable. More flowers, more fruit, a noticeably sweeter flavor. A liquid fertilizer with a ratio like 2:3:6 or something similar where potassium is the highest number is exactly what you want once blooms start forming. Strawberries need a minimum of 6 hours of direct sunlight per day, and 8 is better if you can manage it. This is one area where containers actually give you an advantage over garden beds because you can move pots to chase the light. I have a south-facing patio that gets full morning sun but loses direct light by about 2 in the afternoon once the house casts a shadow. Early in the season, I keep my containers there, but in midsummer, I slide them out to a spot that catches a few extra hours of afternoon light, and that makes a measurable difference in how many flowers the plants produce. On the flip side, extreme heat is a real problem. When temperatures climb above 85 degrees Fahrenheit, strawberry flowers start to abort and fruit production stalls. If you're gardening in zones 8 or 9, you may need to move containers into afternoon shade during the hottest weeks of summer to keep them producing. For colder climates, overwintering is the big concern. Container roots are far more exposed to freezing temperatures than ground roots because there is no insulating earth surrounding them. In zones 5 and below, I either move my containers into an unheated garage or group them together against a south-facing wall and wrap them in burlap stuffed with straw. The goal is to keep the root zone from dropping below about 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which is where serious root damage starts. As your plants grow, you will see them sending out runners, those long horizontal stems with a baby plant at the tip. In a container setting, your default should be to snip most of them off. Every runner the plant puts out is energy diverted away from fruit production, and in a limited space container, you want the plant focused on berries, not babies. I pinch runners every week during my morning check. However, and this is important, do not throw them away. I will cover what to do with them in the bonus tip because they are actually incredibly valuable. For the fruit itself, keeping berries off the soil surface is critical in containers. When a ripening berry sits against damp soil or potting mix, the contact point develops rot almost overnight. I tuck a thin layer of straw mulch around the base of each plant, about 1 inch deep. It keeps the berries elevated, holds moisture in the soil, and looks tidy. Clean straw, not hay, is what you want because hay is full of weed seeds and you do not need that headache in your containers. One other detail that took me a while to figure out: pick berries as soon as they are fully red all the way around. Leaving them on the plant even an extra day or two past peak ripeness sends a hormonal signal that slows down new flower production. Frequent picking actually encourages the plant to keep producing. It sounds counterintuitive, but the plant's goal is to make seeds. As long as it thinks it has not succeeded, it keeps pushing out more flowers and more fruit. Use that biology to your advantage. Let me walk you through the 5 problems I see most often because I have personally dealt with every one of these. First, small or tasteless berries. This is almost always a feeding issue, a crowding issue, or both. If you have too many plants jammed into one container, they compete for nutrients and water, and everyone loses. 6 to 8 plants in a 15-gallon container is the sweet spot. If spacing is fine, bump up your potassium-heavy fertilizer and make sure you're feeding every 2 to 3 weeks. Second, grey mold, which shows up as a fuzzy greyish-brown coating on the berries. This is botrytis, and it thrives when moisture sits on the fruit and foliage. Water at the soil line, not overhead, and make sure there is decent airflow around the plants. Remove any infected berries immediately so the spores do not spread. Third, plants that produce plenty of leaves but no flowers. 9 times out of 10, this is too much nitrogen. Cut back on the balanced fertilizer and switch to something with higher potassium. In rare cases, it can also mean the variety needs more chill hours than your climate provides, which is why variety selection matters so much. Fourth, birds getting to your berries before you do. This one frustrated me for 2 seasons before I finally just draped lightweight bird netting over a simple frame of bamboo stakes pushed into the container. It takes 5 minutes to set up, it works perfectly, and you can lift it easily to harvest. Fifth, plants that wilt even though the soil is moist. This is usually root rot from poor drainage. Check that your drainage holes are not clogged and make sure your soil mix has enough perlite. If the roots are brown and mushy when you pull the plant out, the damage is done and it is time to start fresh with better drainage. All right, here is the bonus tip I promised, and this is something I stumbled onto about 7 years into my gardening journey that completely changed how I think about container strawberries. Remember those runners I told you to pinch off? Instead of throwing all of them away, in late summer, I let 2 or 3 runners per plant root into small 4-inch pots that I set right next to the mother container. I just pin the runner tip down into moist potting mix with a small piece of wire, and within 2 to 3 weeks, the baby plant has its own root system. I snip the runner connecting it to the mother, and now I have a fully independent young plant ready to overwinter. The science behind why this matters is actually pretty straightforward. Strawberry plants are most productive in their first and second year of fruiting. By year 3, the crown gets woody, the roots get congested, and production drops noticeably. If you're always growing this year's fruit on last year's rooted runners, you are constantly cycling in young, vigorous plants and retiring the older ones. I replace about half my containers every year using this method, and it has not cost me a single dollar in new plants for over 5 years now. It is like having a self-renewing strawberry farm on your patio. That is everything I have for you on growing strawberries in containers. It is one of those crops where a little bit of science and a little bit of attention really do pay off in a big way. If you found this helpful, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next one. Happy gardening, and I will see you in the next video.